Hi friends, it's Miss M, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about cueing, or prompting, or assisting, whatever term you use that means support. I'm going to start this off by saying this is something that I'm constantly learning about. I'm constantly changing how I cue, even sometimes, quickly in the moment during a session with a child who maybe all of a sudden needs way less support because something's kind of clicking for them and they're generalizing a skill. And so I like to keep the different things I can do to cue in mind. Now, sometimes it's the opposite and you're having a day where, you need to give a little bit more support. And so kind of knowing where, the different steps of support lie is really helpful for me. And it's something that, like I said, I'm still learning, something that's still being ingrained and I'm still honing skills on. But I thought it would be helpful to kind of share how I cue and how I set my children up for success with the hope of, with the ultimate goal of decreasing my support to increase their independence. So let's talk about it. So we all maybe know, for those of us that use these terms, these cueing terms, we have our minimal support, we have moderate support, we have maximum support. But what do those mean? When I write a goal, obviously I'm not going to be too wordy with exactly how that support looks. I might put a few examples in there, but obviously I'm going to use one of those blanket terms of, we'll do such and such in so many trials given minimal support. But what does that mean? So minimal support, and there could be a quantity in there, right? Maybe minimal for me sometimes means 1 to 2 verbal cues. But again, 1 to 2 when? Per trial, per, session? What does that look like? So I like to think of it in terms of what the actual quality of the support is, because that helps me visualize what is happening in that situation. So minimal support, actually, rewind. Let's go back. Let's talk about maximum support first, because I want to talk about the idea of fading away support versus building up support, because that's kind of how we work our goals, right? We write a goal for a year from now or however long, and we're thinking about fading that support away. So let's start with the maximum support and what that looks like. So for me, maximum support, when I write it in a goal, I'll write, 5 or more cues. But what are those cues? Maximum support could be modeling. Sometimes that's direct imitation. Sometimes maximum support, depending on the goal, if it's like an artic goal, that might mean 5 or more verbal prompts. It might mean 5 or more visual prompts with whatever visual I might be using, or me pointing to, my mouth, or reminding a child to use their slow turtle speech or whatever that is 5 times in, a trial period. So when I'm trying to get, per one trial, right? If they need maximum support, moderate, or minimal. And so depending on the goal, that's what that might look like. Now, if it's a language goal, or if we're working on, putting, using one word for a pragmatic function or something like that. So it could be the modeling of that point, the modeling of using those pictures, or handing those pictures. Something that's really helpful sometimes when I'm working on joint attention and I'm trying to work on giving that maximum support for different, ways of communicating, it's always helpful to have what I call a triad. So if I have an assistant or another teacher or even the parent that I can pull into the session, it's really helpful because it helps me model. Now, what's the most helpful is having a peer model, especially for my preschoolers. I've noticed that when I have a peer model, so if I have a group of 2 students that go to speech, or if I'm doing a push-in service into the classroom and I can utilize one of the, maybe a really good friend of the child to help me model different things. A really great example of this is during snack time, I had a student working on choosing with pictures which snack he wanted, if he wanted crackers or if he wanted string cheese. And they were both very highly preferred choices for this student, but we really wanted to let him know he had control to request. And so we had his pictures out, and so I would sit and we would position him with me and then another student kind of in a triangle where we could kind of get each other's attention a little bit through through the way we were sitting, and then I would give them each turns to choose what they wanted. And so I had the peer model utilizing the board as well, which was really helpful. And then I would model it, and sometimes again I'll have another adult there to model it. In this situation, he needed a little bit more maybe sometimes of that support, that maximum support, so maybe hand over hand was appropriate, you know, if he would reach for the crackers, but I knew he could utilize his snack, his picture board, then I would say, yes, crackers, and then I would gently, you know, touch it with his hand and then give him the crackers. So those are kind of what I would, you know, consider maximum support, that hand over hand, you know, those 5 or more verbal prompts, or the modeling. And then it's always important to kind of know, when do we move to the next level? When do we start to decrease that support? Consistency. And it's one of those things, I always say it's a gut thing, because sometimes, you know, for my students, I'm like, ooh, they need more of a challenge right now. Okay, let's see if they can do it with a little bit less prompting. It's kind of like when you are trialing the cues with speech sounds. So what do? We always have our tactile cues, and then we have our phonemic cues, and then we have our verbal reminders or something like that. Just those different, I'm forgetting one. I already know it. It's like in my head and I can't think of exactly what it is, but you know probably. Anyways, but that's the idea, is like it might be a situation of trial and error, like which cues or how many cues does he really need right now to be successful. And then, you know, a few sessions later, you're having a lot of success with all those maximum cues. So let's try it. Let's try and just do a visual cue. Let's try and let's see if he imitates me without me using hand over hand. And part of that trial period, or trying out if that cueing works or that level of support works, is doing it a couple of times, making it consistent to see what they might pick up on. I have had students that they get used to that hand over hand, and it becomes a little bit of like a cue dependency, I'll call it, or prompt dependency. And so I have seen it where, you know, they're really used to you guiding them through it. And so that's why it's important to challenge them to trial different levels of cueing and know kind of that step by step, okay, well, what can I try next? So let's talk about moderate cues now that we've talked a lot about maximum. So moderate cues are, I've got my notes right here, you know. Moderate cues fall into, or what falls into moderate cueing are those tactile cues. So tapping, I love using tactile cues. I think I'm big on tactile cues just for me, like tapping things out, or, you know, sometimes I like to use whole body tactile cues. So if we're doing multisyllabic words, one of my favorite things to do is sit down for the first syllable and stand up for the second, or sit down, stand up, sit down, or whatever. It seems to be really magical for my students. Gestural cues, so that pointing, visual cues, did I say that already? Visual cues, so having, you know, when I use my sentence strips, or just, you know, when we utilize any of the visuals we have around. And then phonemic cues are really great too, and that's, you know, especially when I'm doing my speech sound or any kind of phonological awareness type of kind of session, then I am utilizing those phonemic cues, you know, oops, starts with the sound or something like that. If we're doing any kind of naming, that really helps too. So that would be my moderate cues, so all those different things. So when we're thinking about, okay, I've done a lot of maximum cueing, I want to try doing those moderate cues, then maybe I'm just going to put the visual out and see if that helps today. Or maybe I'm just going to utilize my point, but I'm not going to model any direct language, or I'm not going to do any hand over hand today. I'm just going to point because they're getting really used to me doing hand over hand and they're really successful with hand over hand. So let's start to fade that away. And I might do that in a session. Starting off strong, I always say it's like a sandwich, right? You start with something that the student is really successful with, then you would do something like that's if you're setting up if you're organizing your session or planning out your session, you do something in the middle that maybe is a little bit more challenging, and we get really good trials in to really learn a skill, and then you end with something really successful. Same way with cueing, in my opinion, especially if you're starting to fade cueing away. I would start, you know, the session off with a lot of cueing, with a lot of support, with a lot of success and praise, and then in the middle I would do my little, okay, I'm going to see if they just respond to the visual because I just set them up. I just let them know what I expected. And then now it might be a little bit more challenging and we might get a little more frustrated, and so I'm going to kind of, you know, wax and wane with the child and see what works. And then in the end, obviously, I'm going to want to do something really successful, and that might just correlate with the activities I've prepared. But if you're with me in speech, you know that I kind of do a lot of following the child's lead. So it maybe doesn't correlate exactly with those activities. I just work in my cueing as I go. So you end with areas of a lot of success, a lot of praise, and maybe you're back to a little bit of hand over hand because you want that child to know that, you know, great, we're going to come back in here next time into the speech room, or when I push into your classroom next time, we're going to be successful again, that kind of a thing. So it kind of helps you know and gauge where you can challenge the student a little bit more and kind of take away that support. But then it also helps the student understand, okay, but I'm still successful, because that's what we want, because we want to encourage that engagement and that enjoyment of communication. Then we'll talk about minimal support. So minimal support is very fun for me because I have a very fun time using my facial expressions. Minimal support is kind of those expectant looks, like, let's see if you can come up with it on your own, but I'm letting you know because look, it's your turn, or whatever. Giving extra wait time might be something that's a little bit more on the minimal side of support. And then verbal reminders. Again, if we're working on rate of speech type of goals or intelligibility, or things like that, giving that verbal reminder, or I'll say, oh, remember, use your sound, or whatever, or those. We all have our different, like snake behind the cage for keeping your tongue behind your teeth for this sound. So you might use that as a minimal cue, right? Oh, remember where your tongue goes, remember behind your teeth. Or I use a lot of very preschool friendly verbiage. So if we're talking about our k sound, it's our dinosaur stomping sound. And I might do my little visual cue, that's our little tactile cue. But I might use it as a visual cue, right? And that to kind of just remind, get that back there. And then, so all my different sounds have different names that I can just verbally remind a student with. And then, if we're doing like a language activity or anything like that, those expectant looks, that wait time is all really helpful. Or even just remember, if we're doing a sequencing activity, and that little verbal reminder of, remember, 1 comes before 2, or something like that. So those are my cueing hierarchy tips. There are lots of different ways to think about cueing too. It's not just, these are the things I use the most in speech therapy, but they may not be the things you use the most. If you kind of think about everything I just said, it's almost like thinking about it in terms of starting with very direct modeling, very direct cues, very direct prompts, and then as we fade out, we're getting more indirect, because that leads to more independence. And there's a lot of different ways we can talk about cueing. Obviously, like I said, these are the things that work for me. You might have different ways you do it. I'd love to learn them, so please share them with me. But then you think about, if you're teaching a child how to use, or an individual how to use their AAC device, or different, maybe picture communication, there might be more things that go into those indirect ways of cueing as you're teaching those skills as well. So keep that in mind, because it's not obviously one size fits all. Cueing is just as individualized as the student's goal that they're working on. It's so different. We all learn different, and that's why there's all these different ways that we can support our students, because there's all kinds of different learners. So we want to make sure we find what works for them. So don't be afraid with your students to kind of trial different ways that might challenge them a little bit more. I think that's the beauty of this, is that we're learning about our students every day, and they are our best teachers too. Or the clients or individuals you work with. I shouldn't just say students, because this goes for whether you're working with, early intervention, little ones, or if you're working with adults. Either way, it's individualized, and that's the beauty of it. So have fun. Remember to, challenge, but make it fun, and I will see you next time. Bye.